Wanted to make a brief video, hopefully, discussing your third essay, which is about Plato's Phaedo and Landsberg's The Experience of Death. Here's the question that I'd like you to respond to. Both Plato and Landsberg believe that death is not what Epicurus said it was, the absolute and permanent end of human existence. So far, so good. That is, we know that both Plato and Landsberg are opponents of Epicurus, insofar as they do not believe that. They do not believe that death is the absolute and permanent end of human existence, or the becoming nothing of the human person in its totality. But how do Plato's and Landsberg's ideas about death and survival of death differ? Well, that's a tough question. This is the hardest part of the course, I think. We have the longest readings, and they're quite complex, very dense. So what you need to do to respond to that part is really make some clarifying decisions about what your overall take is on Plato's Phaedo and what your overall take is on Landsberg. That's the work that you need to do. I mean, obviously reading the text over, looking at the videos will bring you to that point, hopefully, where you can do that. Where you have to come up with some overall take on each of them and their approaches to the subject of death and survival of death. What you don't want to do, and I want to emphasize this, is say, with reference to Plato, give me a summary account of a few of his arguments, and that's it. That would not be responding to the question, and that wouldn't be really what I want you to do. Obviously, you can refer to anything you want in Plato's Phaedo, and you'll have to make decisions, but not just a sort of mechanical, well, here's what Plato said, this is the argument for opposites, and this is the argument for, argument from affinity, and then Landsberg says this and this, and it has to be a comparative account, and you have to show your grasp of what Plato was about in the Phaedo and your grasp of what Landsberg was about in the experience of death. I mean, I know it sounds like maybe I'm making it sound harder than it is, actually. I just don't want you to mechanically write a few things that Plato said and write a few things that Landsberg said, and then at the end I say I agree with such and such. I mean, that's the structure of the thing, but I'm looking for some insight here, and I'm looking for your account of what were their ideas about death and survival of death, immortality. How did they approach it differently? Have a point of view. One of the things in asking you how they differ, one of the things that would be very good to look at is the fact that Landsberg actually does critique Plato in The Experience of Death. He mentions him. There's a fairly long section where he talks about Plato and the Phaedo and where he thinks Plato went wrong and why. I mean, so that would be perhaps a very valuable part of the essay to look at if you're asked, how do these two philosophers differ in their ideas? Let's say their fundamental ideas about death and survival of death. If there's a part where one of the philosophers discusses the other, that can't help but be valuable, So that's the first step. Second step, in which philosopher's ideas in the matter do you personally find most compelling and why? Well, yeah, I mean, it's a two-step thing, as these essay assignments often are. What are the fundamental accounts that these philosophers give, and which one do you prefer and why? That's really up to you. I would like to see as much sort of insight and argumentation in that second part as possible. For instance, what you don't want to do, just as an example, is say, well, I find Landsberg more compelling because I was raised Catholic, or because he's a Christian like me, or I find Plato's more compelling because he doesn't mention God and I'm an atheist. I mean, those things can be the beginning points of critiques of the thing, but they can't just be, well, I'm religious, so I like Landsberg, or I'm not religious, so I like Plato. You can't just sort of say that. You have to sort of say why. What is it in Plato's account, non-religious account that you find compelling, or what is it in Landsberg's account that you find compelling? Um, so I think the toughest part about this assignment is really the first part. How do they really differ? I mean, we know that they're on the same general page and that they both believe in some form of immortality, but how do their views of death differ, and how do their views of immortality differ? As far as the first part, how do their views on death differ? What you can ask yourself is, how would each of them define death? And Plato does define death, or Socrates pretty much defines death. And I would say Landsberg does too. So maybe not so simple to do, but I think that would be a great way of starting. I mean, they conceive of death differently, and they certainly conceive of immortality differently. So it's certainly a lot of basis for that. So, yeah, I mean, it's a tough assignment, but I think it's definitely doable. And you just sort of, I'm just asking you for an account of Plato and Landsberg on these matters, and distinguish them from each other, and then give some sort of argument about which one you think is more compelling, and which is, you think, the better conception of death and the afterlife, and why. So if you have any questions, if you'd like to bounce some ideas off me, please feel free to get in touch.